Back to our top story now. The president is traveling to El Paso, Texas and Dayton, Ohio today after two mass shootings last weekend. At least 31 people were killed in the back-to-back attacks. The president is expected to meet with victims and first responders, but he's also expected to face questions about gun control. This comes after the president urged his support on Monday for red flag laws and did not call for any specific restrictions on guns. For more on gun control legislation, I'm joined by CBS News legal analyst Kim Wehle. Now, Kim, remind us what rights Americans have in terms of gun ownership that is protected by the Second Amendment.
So the Supreme Court of the United States in 2008, in a case called District of Columbia versus Heller, held that the Second Amendment protects the right to own a handgun in the home for purposes of self-defense. That's as far as the Second Amendment goes in terms of what the Supreme Court has said. And prior to that, the court did limit the Second Amendment's protections to militias. So that was a shift in 2008. And the court did signal that the Second Amendment would tolerate restrictions on guns based on other criteria, including how dangerous they are and whether that type of firearm was around at the time the Second Amendment was passed. So the Second Amendment does tolerate restrictions on guns. I think that's one myth that people don't really understand. It's not an unlimited right to gun ownership.
Interesting. You wrote an article back in November of 2017. I'm holding it here. After the Texas church shooting in Sutherland Springs left 26 people dead. And it was called Second Amendment Myths Everyone Should Stop Believing. And you say this still stands today. Explain to us a little bit about what you're talking about and some of those myths.
So I mentioned one of them, and this has to do with how the Constitution works in general. The way the Supreme Court interprets these rights, the Second Amendment, the First Amendment right to free speech, is to take the limitations by the government on one hand, here the restrictions on guns, the problems with that, and then balance on the other side the problems with allowing unlimited gun ownership. And here we have dead people. So obviously there are some problems, some needs that need to be regulated. The court will balance that. And so that was one of the primary myths here, the idea that the Second Amendment is sacrosanct, that there are no limits. That's just not accurate as a matter of constitutional law and as a matter of the Second Amendment. But of course, we have in this particular instance, the National Rifle Association, a huge gun lobby that's holding up legislation in the Senate, really. Mitch McConnell is the person who stands in the way of some reasonable limits within the Second Amendment on gun ownership that most Americans support.
Now, this leads me to my next question. How heavy does this Second Amendment weigh on any legislation that lawmakers could try to pass today? Not just legally, but politically.
Yeah, so, historically, things like abortion and gun legislation have been resolved by legislatures. I say gun legislation. Heller itself involved a challenge to a D.C. handgun ban. So we can ask ourselves, listen, do we want this resolved by 5 members, essentially, of the Supreme Court of the United States, unelected, people that cannot be fired at the ballot box, or should this be resolved sensibly through the legislative process in response to the will of the people? People assume this is a completely constitutional question, and it really isn't. I'm quite confident that this Supreme Court would uphold, as a matter of the Second Amendment, reasonable restrictions on gun ownership, like, for example, background checks, things that really, we have to have a license in order to drive a car, right? And there's only a handful of states in the United States that require a license or some form of licensing to hold a handgun. We have to have a license to sell liquor, things that can harm the general public. We have reasonable restrictions before we can have access to them. Guns are one of them. So this really should be shifted to a common sense, policy-based debate in the legislature, state and federal legislature. But as I mentioned, there are massive barriers to entry that really come down to money. That is a disconnect between the will of individual Americans and what's actually happening in the halls of the legislatures.
Now, some have even suggested appealing the Second Amendment, and some people in certain states, of course, just clutch their pearls when they hear that. How would that be done legally, and what would this do?
So any changes to the Constitution are really laborious and difficult by design. So you would need 2/3 of both houses of the federal legislature, and then it would have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. We're not in a position where we're seeing 2/3 of the House and the Senate, both Republicans and Democrats, agree on almost anything right now. So that's not a realistic. A repeal of the Second Amendment is not realistic. But that's really getting around to this Heller decision. As I said, the Supreme Court historically said, listen, the Second Amendment is about militias. The framers were worried about the ability of people to basically band together against England or against their own government and take their government back in that particular instance where it was at risk. Not necessarily that every person gets to have a handgun or a semi-automatic weapon, for example. The Second Amendment refers to the word arms. It doesn't define the word arms. So, for example, if someone had plutonium in their garage to build a nuclear weapon, I don't think there's any question that a court would say that is far afield of the Second Amendment. That concept of arms doesn't go that far. And I think that the reasonable restrictions on other kinds of weapons that were designed in World War II to basically maximize damage on human flesh, that kind of thing is probably not going to be protected by the Second Amendment itself.
Yeah, there's no longer muskets that are being used. Kim, keep your cell phone on because I have a feeling we're going to need your insight as this debate rages on. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Omar.